You close your eyes, and we begin with an image that is both ordinary and unsettling. It is dawn in a medieval town. The streets are narrow, damp with last night's rain, and a thin layer of mist clings to the cobblestones. Somewhere, a rooster crows, reminding you that, despite the weight of history pressing upon this place, life still unfolds in familiar rhythms. Bakers knead dough, children stir in their sleep, and merchants prepare their stalls. Yet, on the edge of this community lives a figure both integral to its functioning and ostracized from its heart, the executioner. Executioners in medieval Europe occupied a paradoxical role. They were not merely individuals who carried out capital punishment. They were symbols of state power, embodiments of justice, and, paradoxically, necessary pariahs. Their craft was essential to maintaining the structure of law and order, yet their presence unsettled those around them. You can imagine the executioner's house situated slightly apart from the town square, near the gallows or the scaffold. Though they were given a dwelling and paid a wage, their neighbors would rarely greet them openly. Their children might have been avoided by others, their spouses whispered about, their hands regarded as tainted no matter how clean. The daily routine of an executioner was more varied than you might expect. Contrary to popular imagination, executions were not a daily affair. In fact, in many towns, months could pass without the need for one. During these lulls, executioners earned their keep through a range of other duties that were often as unpleasant as they were necessary. They might be called upon to dispose of animal carcasses, clean cesspits, or even perform the role of torturer when interrogations demanded it. In some places, executioners doubled as knackers, dealing with dead livestock and preventing disease from spreading into human populations. One could argue that the executioner lived closer to the realities of life and death than most others in their community. While the townspeople might fear disease, crime, or divine punishment, the executioner dealt directly with the physical manifestations of these fears. Death was not a far-off concept but a part of daily labor. Their hands were stained not just with blood but with the residue of humanity's darker necessities. And yet, this same individual might go home, share a meal with their family, or sit quietly by the fire. This contradiction, the ordinary woven into the extraordinary, was the reality of the medieval executioner's existence. Payment for such a role was not straightforward. In many regions, executioners were compensated in part by the goods or clothing of the condemned. After a hanging, for instance, the executioner might receive the victim's boots or tunic. Sometimes they were entitled to keep rope from the gallows, which could later be sold as a morbid charm believed to bring luck or protection. In this way, the role was tied as much to superstition as it was to legal enforcement. But imagine the physical toll. The executioner's craft required precision and endurance. In an age before modern tools and reliable technology, executions did not always go as planned. A sword or axe might not strike cleanly. A rope might snap. A stake might take longer to burn than expected. The executioner carried the weight of this responsibility, not just for the condemned but for the crowd that gathered to witness the event. If an execution was botched, it was not only the condemned who suffered, but the executioner himself could be humiliated or even attacked by angry spectators. Still, there was a strange kind of respect mixed into the fear. Some executioners gained reputations as skilled craftsmen of death, known for their swiftness and precision. Their names might be remembered not with affection but with a grudging acknowledgement of their competence. Others became infamous for cruelty or incompetence, cursed by both the condemned and the crowd. You can imagine the executioner at night, perhaps after an execution day, sitting alone in his chamber. The firelight flickers on the walls, shadows dancing like reminders of the lives taken. He might sharpen his tools, carefully maintaining the edge of a sword or axe, knowing that tomorrow or next month or next year, he would be called again. Outside, the town continues to breathe, largely oblivious to the man whose work made their sense of order possible. And so the question lingers, what must it have felt like to live a life in which your very livelihood depended on the misfortunes of others, where your survival was tied to death itself? When you think of an executioner, the first image that often comes to mind is of the great hooded figure, faceless and silent, looming above a trembling condemned prisoner. Yet the true reality was far more mundane, and in many ways, more unsettling. The executioner's work was not cloaked in mystery but in meticulous preparation. Every tool had its purpose, every gesture was measured, and every outcome, at least ideally, was predictable. Let us begin with the tools of the trade. These varied widely depending on the type of punishment decreed by the court. In the Germanic lands, for example, the executioner's sword was a distinctive instrument. Unlike the swords used by knights or soldiers, it was heavy, broad, and unsharpened along its edges except for the top few inches. Its sole purpose was decapitation, and in skilled hands, it could bring a swift and merciful end. In England, by contrast, the axe was often the preferred tool, though its effectiveness depended greatly on both the quality of the blade and the steadiness of the executioner's arm. Hanging, of course, was common across much of Europe, and it presented its own complications. In an age before the precise measurements of the long drop were developed, hangings could be slow, cruel affairs. The condemned might strangle for many minutes, twisting and gasping before death came. Sometimes, ropes broke under the weight. On rare occasions, the condemned survived long enough to be granted reprieve, though this was never guaranteed. The executioner bore the brunt of responsibility for ensuring the crowd was satisfied that justice had been properly served, yet he often had little control over the quality of the materials given to him. Burnings, though less frequent, required careful staging. Wood had to be arranged so that the flames would rise quickly but not so furiously as to lose control. The condemned might be strangled before the fire reached them, a grim form of mercy, or left to suffer as the spectacle unfolded. The executioner, standing at the center of these events, was not simply killing but orchestrating a public ritual. Public spectacle was central to the executioner's craft. These events were never private affairs. They were staged deliberately in marketplaces, at crossroads, or before castle gates, places where the greatest number of people could gather. You can imagine the crowd swelling around the scaffold, merchants pausing their trade, children perched on shoulders, beggars jostling for position, and nobles peering from balconies. All eyes fixed on the executioner, who bore the strange weight of both revulsion and expectation. Crowds were fickle. If the execution was swift and clean, the executioner might be rewarded with a few approving murmurs, perhaps even coins tossed toward him. But if it was botched, if the axe slipped or the condemned screamed for too long, the same crowd could turn hostile in an instant. In some cases, the executioner himself had to flee for safety, pelted with stones or insults. Reputation, then, was everything. Skilled executioners were valued, though never embraced. Some became so renowned for their ability that rulers sought them out specifically. The French executioner Charles-Henri Sanson, though later in history during the 18th century, is a prime example. He oversaw thousands of deaths, including that of Louis XVI himself, and was respected for his precision. But centuries earlier, in smaller towns, executioners could likewise build legacies, often passed down within families. Indeed, it was not unusual for the position to become hereditary, passed from father to son, not because of honor but because few others would dare to take on the burden. Executioner families lived in a strange limbo. They were legally tied to their duties, granted certain privileges such as exemption from taxes or the right to collect tolls, but socially, they remained untouchable. Marriage prospects for their children were limited, often confined to others within the same profession. In some places, the families of executioners intermarried across generations, creating entire dynasties bound by their grim trade. Even so, within the executioner's household, life carried on with ordinary rhythms. There were meals to prepare, clothes to mend, and children to raise. The tools of death might hang in the shed or lean against the wall, but they coexisted with wooden toys and cooking pots. Imagine the jarring contrast: the same hands that tied a noose in the morning might cradle an infant at night. Superstition also clung stubbornly to the executioner's role. People feared his touch, believing it carried contamination, yet paradoxically, they sought it out for healing. In some regions, executioners were believed to have special powers over disease, and their salves or remedies, often made from herbs or animal fats, were considered strangely effective. Some believed that the rope of a hanged man could cure ailments, and so executioners quietly profited from selling such macabre charms. In this way, they existed in the same liminal space as other socially marginalized figures, gravediggers, lepers, and even witches, but think, for a moment, of the psychological toll. Every profession carries its weight, yet few demanded the same uneasy balance between duty and revulsion. Executioners were constantly reminded of their role by the stares of neighbors, the whispers at markets, the empty seats beside them in church. And yet, they were also indispensable. Towns and kingdoms could not function without them. Law required not only judgment but enforcement, and the executioner was the arm of that enforcement. There are fragments of letters, records, and even memoirs that give us glimpses into their inner world. Some executioners described their work with matter-of-fact detachment, seeing themselves as simply fulfilling their duty to the community. Others struggled openly with guilt, even drinking heavily to dull their conscience. A few justified their work with a kind of fatalistic philosophy: someone had to do it, and better to do it cleanly than cruelly. And so, you can see how the executioner's life was shaped not just by the act of killing, but by the constant negotiation between fear and necessity, isolation and service, condemnation and grudging respect. As we picture the executioner sharpening his sword by firelight or testing the strength of a new rope, another question emerges: did he see himself as an instrument of justice, or merely as a man trapped in a profession that offered no escape? The medieval executioner lived in two worlds, one of duty and one of exile. In this final section, let us step deeper into that paradox, how his work rippled beyond the scaffold, shaping not only his own life but the lives of his descendants, his community, and even the way justice itself was perceived. Executioners were bound by contract and obligation. Many were appointed directly by the crown, by a noble lord, or by a town council. Once chosen, it was not an easy role to abandon. The stigma attached to the position meant that resignation was rarely an option, for no other profession would welcome a man who had lived by the axe or sword. Thus, many executioners were locked into their work for life. If a man tried to quit, he might find himself pressed back into service. After all, no one else would step forward. And so, execution often became hereditary, the father passing the burden to the son, whether willingly or reluctantly. In some cities, executioners wielded surprising privileges. They might be granted a house on the edge of town, exemptions from taxes, or rights to tolls collected from bridges or markets. A few became relatively wealthy, though their wealth never translated into social acceptance. Even when their purses were full, they were not welcome in taverns, guilds, or respectable marriages. They existed outside the boundaries of ordinary society, tethered to it only by the necessities of law and punishment. Still, the executioner was not always a silent figure. There are recorded instances of executioners refusing to carry out their tasks if they deemed the punishment unjust or improperly ordered. This resistance was rare, but it reveals that some executioners saw themselves as more than mere instruments. They saw themselves as arbiters of a kind of fairness within the machinery of justice. A poorly ordered execution could reflect not only on the condemned but on the town, the rulers, and the very law itself. Public executions, too, had purposes far beyond punishment. They were moral theater, designed to warn the crowd, to instill fear, and to reinforce authority. The executioner was both actor and stagehand, directing the final moments of a condemned life for maximum effect. You can imagine him stepping onto the scaffold, the crowd falling silent, every gaze fixed on his movements. The condemned might plead or protest, pray or curse, but it was the executioner who controlled the pace, the gestures, and the moment of conclusion. And yet, the spectacle always came at a cost. Imagine the weight of being remembered not as a man, but as the one who killed. Children in town might whisper the name with dread. Strangers might cross the street to avoid brushing against him. Even the church, the one institution that welcomed all, often relegated executioners and their families to separate pews or burial grounds. Death was their trade, and so death clung to them in life. The legacy of executioners is complicated. In some places, their families formed long dynasties. The Sansons of France carried out executions for over a century. In Nuremberg, the Franz Schmidt family produced one of the most famous executioners, who left behind a detailed journal of his work. His records describe hundreds of executions, but also a quiet humanity. He noted the crimes of the condemned, their last words, and even moments of mercy. In his writing, you sense the tension between the necessity of the task and the compassion of the man. There is also the matter of ritual. Executioners often prepared the condemned in their final hours. They tied ropes, adjusted blocks, and fastened shackles, yes, but sometimes they also offered words of comfort. A condemned man might confess to the executioner, receive last advice, or even beg for a quick and merciful end. In that moment, the executioner became both punisher and companion, the last human contact before death. It is here, perhaps, that we see most clearly the strange role executioners played in society, both feared and needed, despised and depended upon. And when the execution was over, when the body was taken down and the crowd dispersed, the executioner often performed one final task. He might dismember the corpse, display severed heads on spikes, or quarter the body for display at city gates. These were not acts of cruelty, but of law, meant to send messages of deterrence. Yet for the executioner, the work did not end at death. His duty extended into the afterlife of the condemned, shaping how their body was remembered and how their crime was marked. What, then, becomes of a man who spends his life as both servant of the law and outcast of society? Some sought solace in religion, others in family ties, others still in drink. A few leaned into the role, embracing their reputation with pride. But most, it seems, lived in quiet contradiction, doing the work no one else would do, and bearing the consequences of it in silence. As you drift into this reflection, you might picture one last image, the executioner at the end of his life. His tools, worn and heavy, rest unused in a corner. The gallows in the square has been rebuilt many times, yet his own body grows frail. He has carried out justice for decades, though he has rarely been thanked. Perhaps his son waits to inherit the role, or perhaps there is no heir, and the town council wonders who will step forward next. The fire crackles low, the shadows lengthen, and the executioner stares into the embers. Did he see himself as a monster, as others did? Or as a necessary part of the order that kept his town safe? Did he regret his life, or accept it with weary resignation? We will never know for certain. But what we do know is this: the executioner, though cast into the margins, was central to the story of justice in the medieval world. His life reminds us that history is not only shaped by kings, lords, and warriors, but also by those whose names were spoken in fear, whose hands carried out the sentences of the law, and whose shadows still linger in the spaces between justice and cruelty. And so, the story of the medieval executioner leaves us with a lingering question: in a society that demands justice, who bears the cost of carrying it out? When you imagine a medieval execution, perhaps you see the scaffold, the axe, the rope, and the trembling figure awaiting death. But behind that image lies something deeper, something political. Every execution was not only about punishing a crime, but about displaying the authority of those in power. To understand the true meaning of these spectacles, you must step back and see them not as isolated events, but as part of a larger theater of control. In the medieval world, justice was never merely a matter of law. It was an extension of sovereignty. Kings, lords, and city councils all claimed the right to enforce order, and nothing made that claim more visible than the act of execution. When the condemned mounted the scaffold, it was not only their life that ended, but also their defiance of authority. The crowd gathered not simply to witness a punishment, but to see the law itself come alive, embodied in the blade, the rope, or the fire. The location of executions was carefully chosen. They were staged in public spaces where the maximum number of people could watch. In Paris, the Place de Grève became synonymous with executions, drawing immense crowds from across the city. In London, Tyburn served a similar role. These were not hidden places but central stages, deliberately woven into the fabric of daily life. By situating death at the heart of the city, rulers reminded their subjects that power was ever-present, unavoidable, and absolute. Executions also reflected hierarchy. Nobles condemned to death might be granted a private beheading, often by sword, considered more honorable. Commoners, by contrast, faced hanging or burning, punishments meant to humiliate as much as to kill. The method of death was not random, it was carefully chosen to reinforce social order. To die by axe was to acknowledge noble blood, while to dangle from the gallows was to mark one as base and dishonored. In this way, even in death, society's structure was maintained, but executions were more than demonstrations of hierarchy, they were opportunities for rulers to project mercy or severity as circumstances demanded. Sometimes, a condemned man might be pardoned at the last moment, with the king or lord appearing magnanimous, granting life as though it were a gift held in his hand. Other times, punishment was exaggerated, made more brutal to send a message. A thief might lose a hand before being hanged, or a rebel might be quartered after death, their body displayed across multiple cities. These choices were never accidental, they were calibrated to maintain control. The political nature of execution is most visible in times of unrest. When rebellions broke out, executions became not just punishments, but statements. Consider the aftermath of the peasants' revolt in England in 1381. Once the uprising was suppressed, dozens of rebels were executed in public squares. Their deaths were not simply retribution, they were warnings to the population at large. Each body on the gallows whispered the same reminder: the king's authority could not be challenged without consequence. In some cases, executions were choreographed almost like ceremonies. Trumpets might sound, heralds might read the charges aloud, and clergy would step forward to offer the condemned a chance at final confession. The crowd was not only entertained but instructed, taught what crime looked like, what punishment awaited, and what submission to authority required. The executioner himself was only one actor in this larger play. The real directors were the rulers who used death as a tool of governance. Yet these displays were not without risk. A public execution could backfire if the crowd sympathized with the condemned. There are accounts of townspeople weeping for criminals who seemed repentant, or even rioting if they felt the punishment was unjust. Executions of popular figures, such as political rebels or heretics, sometimes stirred more sympathy than fear. Rulers had to manage these moments carefully, ensuring that the display of power did not turn into an opportunity for resistance. Still, the enduring lesson was clear: executions were never just about crime. They were about communication. Each hanging, each burning, each severed head spoke a language that everyone could understand, the language of authority. To live in the medieval world was to live under constant reminders that life itself could be claimed or spared by those in power. As you let this thought settle, imagine standing in that crowd centuries ago. You feel the press of bodies around you, the murmurs, the anticipation. You see the condemned brought forward, shackled and pale. You see the herald raise his voice, declaring the crimes. You see the executioner lift his blade. And above all, you feel the invisible weight of the ruler who has made this moment possible. It was not just a death. It was a performance of power. And so we are left with a question: when justice becomes theater, is it truly about fairness, or is it only about control? If executions were stages upon which rulers displayed their authority, then the crowd was the essential audience. Without them, the performance lost its meaning. Every scaffold, every gallows, every block of wood was constructed with one purpose in mind: to be seen. And so, the politics of execution were not confined to the condemned and the ruler, they were woven into the very fabric of the community that gathered to watch. Consider the atmosphere of an execution day. It was rarely somber in the way modern audiences might imagine. Instead, it often resembled a festival. Merchants set up stalls to sell food and drink. Jugglers and ballad singers might entertain the waiting crowd. Children jostled for a better view, while beggars stretched out their hands to passing nobles. The condemned was not alone in facing judgment, the entire community participated, directly or indirectly, in the spectacle. The authorities encouraged this participation. By gathering the populace, they turned the act of punishment into a communal lesson. Each witness became both spectator and enforcer, reminded of the power that governed their lives. In this way, executions served not only to eliminate criminals but also to reinforce the invisible chains of obedience. The gallows was less a place of justice than a classroom in which fear was the curriculum. Yet the crowd was unpredictable. Their reaction could elevate the political message, or undermine it entirely. A condemned thief who wept and begged might provoke contempt, confirming his guilt in the eyes of the people. But a rebel who spoke eloquently, proclaiming his cause as just, might win unexpected sympathy. Imagine the hush that fell over a square as a condemned heretic defiantly shouted his beliefs, or as a political prisoner forgave his enemies with dignity. In such moments, the intended message of power could be twisted, leaving the authorities uneasy. Records show that rulers and city officials often took great care in managing how executions unfolded. Some condemned individuals were silenced before reaching the scaffold, gagged to prevent them from stirring unrest. Others were paraded through the streets in humiliation, forced to endure jeers before their final punishment. The timing of executions was also strategic. A ruler might delay an execution to coincide with a feast day, ensuring the maximum number of witnesses. Or he might rush it, seeking to quell unrest before it spread. The architecture of execution also carried political meaning. Scaffolds were raised high, ensuring visibility for all. Gallows were often erected at crossroads, where travelers from multiple directions would encounter them. Decapitated heads were displayed on spikes above city gates, a chilling greeting to anyone entering the town. Each placement was a deliberate act of communication. Here is the body of someone who defied authority, here is what will happen to you if you do the same. This use of the body as symbol extended even after death. In cases of treason, quartered limbs might be sent to different cities, magnifying the warning across an entire region. The body ceased to be human and became instead a message, a physical text inscribed with the language of law and order. But the politics of execution were not always top-down. Crowds could, in their own way, shape the ritual. There are accounts of executioners being pressured by the audience to deliver a swift and merciful death, or, in some cases, to prolong the suffering for spectacle. If the crowd felt cheated, as when a criminal died too quickly, they might riot or pelt the executioner with stones. Thus, while rulers sought to use executions to control the people themselves exerted a subtle influence over the performance. Executions also revealed divisions within society. Nobles might watch from raised platforms, sheltered from the press of commoners. Clergy stood nearby to offer prayers, positioning the church as both spiritual comforter and partner in justice. Meanwhile, ordinary townsfolk crowded the square, jostling for position, some curious, some fearful, some secretly relieved that it was not their own neck on the block. The scaffold became a mirror reflecting the stratified layers of medieval life. One cannot overlook the role of religion in this theater. Execution was often framed as a moment of salvation for the condemned, an opportunity to confess and secure their soul before death. The presence of priests lent legitimacy to the act, reminding the crowd that the punishment was not merely political but divinely sanctioned. To disobey the king was, in this framework, to disobey God. Yet, once again, the message could be complicated. A heretic who went to death unrepentant might inadvertently inspire admiration for his steadfastness, planting seeds of doubt in the minds of those who watched. Over time, authorities refined the choreography of executions, learning from moments when the crowd's reaction strayed from the intended lesson. They sought to control every detail, the words spoken by the herald, the route of the procession, the timing of the blade. And yet, the human element could never be fully contained. Fear, pity, anger, and even admiration all mingled in the square, producing an atmosphere that was as volatile as it was predictable. To stand in that crowd was to experience the paradox of medieval justice. You were both participant and bystander, drawn to the spectacle by curiosity, yet bound by fear to accept the message it conveyed. You cheered or jeered, not always because you wished to, but because the performance demanded it. And so we are left with a thought: if the crowd was essential to the spectacle of execution, did they truly learn obedience, or were they simply taught to mask their doubts beneath the noise of the performance? By now, you can see how medieval executions were never isolated events. They were woven into the very fabric of politics, staged and restaged in towns and cities as a continual reminder of authority. But authority is never absolute. It relies on perception, and perception is fragile. This final section turns to the delicate balance between fear and rebellion, obedience and resistance, and how execution sometimes strengthened power, but at other times weakened it. The idea of deterrence, the belief that seeing one person die would prevent others from committing crimes, was central to the political use of executions. A thief's dangling body on the gallows at a crossroads was meant to deter other thieves. A traitor's quartered limbs nailed to town gates were intended to terrify potential rebels. But deterrence relied on belief, and belief was not always guaranteed. For some, the sight of a comrade executed only deepened anger. For others, it inspired pity, or even admiration. Take, for example, the execution of William Wallace in 1305. To English authorities, his brutal death, hanged, drawn, and quartered, was meant to silence Scottish resistance. Yet far from extinguishing rebellion, Wallace's death fed the flames of Scottish nationalism, turning him into a martyr. The message of power was clear, but it was received in a way that authorities did not intend. This risk was inherent in every public execution. The audience could not be fully controlled. Similarly, heretical movements across Europe reveal the political gamble of execution. Burning heretics at the stake was meant to purge society of dangerous ideas and demonstrate the triumph of orthodoxy. Yet executions often had the opposite effect. A heretic who went to the flames singing hymns or refusing to recant could inspire followers rather than deter them. The death of Jan Hus in 1415, for instance, did not end the movement for reform in Bohemia. Instead, it triggered the Hussite Wars. Authorities understood these risks, but they also knew that failing to punish could be interpreted as weakness. Thus, rulers often erred on the side of severity. Executions were multiplied in times of unrest, their brutality amplified. After the German Peasants' War in 1525, tens of thousands of peasants were executed, their bodies displayed as warnings. It was not simply justice, it was a deliberate attempt to crush dissent through fear. Yet fear has limits. When applied too harshly, it breeds resentment. When applied too often, it becomes ordinary. Executions that once shocked and terrified could, over time, become background noise, spectacles attended as entertainment rather than moral lessons. By the late Middle Ages, some chroniclers lamented that people treated executions more as carnivals than as solemn warnings. Instead of strengthening authority, such spectacles risked trivializing it. The executioner himself, though central to the act, remained a minor player in the politics at work. His role was technical, but the consequences of his actions reverberated widely. A clean, dignified execution could reinforce the authority of the state. A botched one could spark unrest, mockery, or even rebellion. In this sense, the executioner's blade was as much a political instrument as a weapon. We must also consider how executions function differently across regions. In kingdoms with strong central authority, such as France, they reinforced the image of the monarch as supreme judge. In city-states like Florence or Venice, they reflected the collective power of the ruling council. In frontier regions, executions might be more ad hoc, serving as reminders of fragile order in unstable territories. But in every case, they served the same essential purpose, to transform individual punishment into a public affirmation of power. And yet, Despite their political importance, executions did not always achieve their intended results. If a ruler pardoned too often, his mercy might be mistaken for weakness. If he punished too harshly, he might provoke unrest. If the crowd sympathized with the condemned, the spectacle could turn against him. Thus, every execution was a gamble, a moment in which authority revealed itself not as absolute, but as negotiated, fragile, and deeply dependent on perception. By the early modern period, the politics of execution began to shift. With the rise of more bureaucratic states, justice moved slowly from public spectacle to more controlled environments, and eventually to prisons. But in the medieval centuries, the scaffold remained the stage upon which power was most visibly performed. So picture one last scene. A ruler sits in his hall, advisors gathered around him. A rebel has been captured, tried, and condemned. The decision lies before him: how shall the execution be carried out? Shall it be swift and merciful, a show of noble strength? Or shall it be brutal and prolonged, a warning to all who might dream of defiance? The ruler weighs not only the crime but the audience, the mood of the people, the risks of sympathy or anger. And in that moment, you realize, the execution is not only about the man condemned to die. It is about the delicate dance between power and perception, the constant negotiation between fear and obedience that shaped medieval society. The story of medieval executions, then, is not only about justice, nor only about cruelty. It is about politics, the fragile theater in which rulers sought to display their strength, and in which every act of death was also an act of governance. And so we are left with a lingering thought: when a ruler wields the power of life and death, does it make him strong, or does it reveal just how precarious his authority truly is? In the medieval imagination, few figures were as simultaneously necessary and despised as the executioner. His task was sanctioned by the law, his wages paid from public coffers, and his work vital to the stability of order. And yet, he was marked by shame. To touch him was considered dangerous, to live beside him undesirable. He was the paradox of medieval justice, a man without whom the system could not function, and yet a man denied full participation in the society he served. This stigma clung not only to the executioner himself but also to his family. Children of executioners were often barred from joining guilds, the powerful associations of craftsmen that regulated trades and professions. No matter how skilled a boy might be in carpentry or smithing, his father's profession tainted his prospects. Daughters of executioners found marriage difficult, as respectable families refused alliances with those whose bread was earned through blood. In many towns, executioner families were forced to intermarry, binding them together in a closed circle of shared shame. Yet, paradoxically, executioners could also enjoy certain privileges. They were sometimes granted homes at the edge of town, exemption from certain taxes, or rights to collect tolls. These were not rewards for honor but compensations for the dishonor they endured. Their position was liminal, outside the community in spirit, yet tied to it in necessity. One striking detail about medieval executioners is their association with impurity. In Christian thought, blood had powerful symbolic meaning. To shed it was often considered polluting, and the executioner's constant contact with blood marked him as spiritually unclean. This belief extended into daily life. People avoided shaking hands with him, sharing meals with him, or even brushing against his clothing. The executioner was, in effect, a living paradox. He upheld divine justice, yet he bore the stain of sin. Because of this stigma, executioners often lived on the margins, literally. Their houses might be located near the gallows, outside city walls, or by rivers where bodies could be washed away. Their children sat apart in church, their families buried in separate plots of land. Even their profession tied them to liminality. They dealt with those who had been cast out by society, whether criminals, heretics, or rebels. They were themselves outsiders, administering the ultimate punishment to other outsiders. And yet, within this stigma, a strange respect sometimes flickered. Executioners were feared, yes, but they were also believed to possess unusual powers. Because of their proximity to death, they were thought to have healing abilities. The touch of an executioner might cure ailments such as goiters or epilepsy. The rope from a hanged man was sold as a talisman against evil. In this way, executioners moved uneasily between the roles of pariah and healer, despised for their work but sought after for their strange powers. Still, the stigma of blood weighed heavily. Executioners rarely chose their profession freely. Often, they were criminals whose lives were spared in exchange for taking up the role. Others inherited it from fathers who had been bound by the same bargain. Once the role was accepted, escape was difficult. Even if an executioner abandoned his duties, he would carry the mark of shame wherever he went. The shame also followed them into their personal lives. Imagine the child of an executioner walking through a market. Other children step aside, mothers whisper warnings, merchants glance with suspicion. The child has committed no crime, yet the family profession shapes his destiny. If he is a son, he may be expected to take up the role himself. If a daughter, she may be forced to marry within the small circle of other executioner families. Entire lineages were trapped within this cycle of stigma, generation after generation. And so, in this first stage of our story, we see the executioner as a man. Burdened not only by his grim work but also by the social and spiritual stain it carried. He was necessary, but never embraced. Powerful, but never honored. It leaves us with a haunting question: how can a man live when his very livelihood condemns him to shame, even as it sustains the community that rejects him? The executioner of the Middle Ages was shrouded in dishonor, yet as centuries passed, a curious transformation began. The very figure once defined by shame slowly evolved into something resembling a professional. The shift was neither sudden nor simple, it unfolded across generations, shaped by necessity, reputation, and the changing expectations of justice. One of the strongest forces behind this transformation was heredity. Because few volunteered for the position, executioners' families formed dynasties. Sons inherited their father's trade, often reluctantly, and daughters married within the same circle, ensuring the profession persisted. Over time, this continuity created an unusual stability. A name once associated with shame could, through skill and reputation, become synonymous with competence. Communities that despised executioners still preferred a skilled one to an untrained novice who might botch the act. Thus, skill became the seed of professional respect. The most striking example of this transformation is found in the memoir of Franz Schmidt, an executioner of Nuremberg in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Schmidt left behind a meticulous journal of his work, recording over 300 executions and hundreds of corporal punishments. His notes reveal a man who approached his role with methodical care, balancing efficiency with a surprising degree of humanity. He viewed his work not as cruelty but as a solemn duty, one he sought to perform with dignity. His writings gave future generations an unusual glimpse into the inner life of an executioner, one who saw himself less as a pariah and more as a servant of justice. Reputation matter immensely. A botched execution could haunt a man's name, while a clean and swift act could build grudging respect. In places like France, executioners even gained ceremonial titles. The Sanson family, who served as royal executioners for generations, became almost legendary. Charles-Henri Sanson presided over thousands of deaths during the 18th century, including the execution of King Louis XVI. Despite the horror of his work, he was recognized as a figure of precision, professionalism, and even reliability. This growing sense of professionalism was also tied to the evolution of justice itself. As legal systems became more standardized, executions shifted from being chaotic, localized punishments to more orderly rituals. The executioner's role became formalized within this framework, moving from a despised necessity to an institutionalized officer of justice. He was still feared, still avoided, but he was no longer viewed solely as an outcast, he was a functionary of the state. Interestingly, this shift also reshaped the executioner's private life. Families that had once been trapped in cycles of isolation began to leverage their unique position. Some grew wealthy, not only from official wages but also from side businesses tied to their grim trade, selling charms, offering medical cures, or collecting fees for corporal punishments. In some cases, executioner families became semi-respected, their lineage granting them a strange kind of authority. The paradox, however, never fully disappeared. Executioners remained figures of contradiction, half feared, half respected, half despised, half necessary. They were no longer merely pariahs but professionals, and yet the taint of their role clung to them. Even when respected for their skill, they were rarely embraced socially. Their children might still struggle to marry outside their circles, their homes might still be located on the edges of town, and their names might still provoke whispers. Religion also played a part in this transformation. While the Church initially reinforced the idea of executioners as spiritually tainted, over time it leaned into the notion of justice as a divine act. If rulers were God's representatives on earth, then the executioner, carrying out the law, was an extension of divine will. This shift did not erase the stigma, but it gave the executioner a mantle of legitimacy that earlier centuries had denied him. The executioner's growing professionalism also changed the way the condemned experienced their final moments. Skilled executioners could offer mercy in the form of a swift strike, and some became known for their quiet compassion. A condemned prisoner might request a specific executioner, trusting his ability to bring a quick end. In this sense, the executioner's role expanded from feared killer to reluctant companion in death, guiding the condemned through their final passage with both precision and, at times, empathy. By the early modern period, the executioner had become something more than a figure of shame. He was a fixture of justice, a professional bound by duty, and in some cases, even a figure whose name carried weight beyond the scaffold. His legacy was no longer defined solely by stigma but by a strange mix of dishonor, authority, and skill. And so we are left with a question: when does necessity transform into legitimacy, and when does a pariah, by virtue of service, become a professional? By the time Europe moved from the medieval into the early modern period, the figure of the executioner had undergone a profound transformation. No longer merely the faceless outcast who carried out society's most dreaded tasks, he had become an enduring part of legal history, one whose legacy stretched far beyond the scaffold. This legacy is complex. On one hand, executioners remained indelibly linked to death, punishment, and social stigma. On the other, their work became embedded in the memory of justice itself. In some cities, the names of executioner families became as familiar as those of guild masters, judges, or even local nobles. Generations of Sansons in France, Schmidts in Germany, and others across Europe turned the executioner's role into dynasties. Their work left behind records, memoirs, and reputations that continue to inform our understanding of justice today. One of the most remarkable aspects of this legacy is the sheer meticulousness of their documentation. Franz Schmidt's execution journal, mentioned earlier, is not simply a record of punishment but a window into the evolving nature of law and order. His careful listing of crimes, sentences, and outcomes provides historians with insight into how societies define justice and how often they turn to death as a solution. Without such records, much of the daily machinery of medieval justice would be lost to time. The executioner, in this way, became an unintentional historian. Over time, executioners' families began to weave themselves into broader society. While still tainted by the old shame, their indispensability brought certain advantages. In France, some executioner families intermarried with minor nobility, blurring the lines between dishonor and prestige. In cities like Nuremberg, the children of executioners were gradually allowed to enter guilds or universities, especially as the profession gained legitimacy under more bureaucratic states. What had once been a closed circle of outcasts slowly began to open. This opening also reflects a larger shift, the decline of the public execution as spectacle. By the 17th and 18th centuries, justice was increasingly moving behind walls. Prisons, penal colonies, and administrative courts began to replace the open-air theater of punishment. The executioner was still necessary, but his presence in daily life diminished. He became less of a public figure of shame and more of a quiet state official, and yet, the symbolic weight of his role persisted. Even in decline, the executioner carried with him centuries of associations with blood, justice, and fear. In folklore and superstition, he remained a liminal figure, straddling life and death, law and crime, purity and pollution. Children still whispered about executioners' powers, and amulets made from ropes or bones still circulated in rural markets. The legacy also lives on in the way we remember justice. Today, when we look back at the Middle Ages, the executioner looms large as a symbol of the harshness of the age. His axe, his rope, his sword, these tools of death remind us of a time when justice was both immediate and visible. Yet beyond the symbols lies the human reality, men born into shame, struggling with their place in society, and slowly transforming their role from outcast to professional, from nameless figure to part of history. Perhaps most striking is the way executioners themselves understood their work. Many did not revel in cruelty. Some, like Schmidt, sought forgiveness for the blood they had spilled, framing their profession as obedience to law rather than personal choice. Others viewed themselves as guardians of order, bearing the heavy burden of a task no one else would take. In their reflections, we see a legacy not only of death but also of endurance, the endurance of men and families who carried a stigma for generations, yet found ways to turn it into continuity, even into a kind of reluctant honor. By the 19th century, the role of executioner was fading into bureaucratic obscurity. In some countries, the title lingered officially until capital punishment itself was abolished. In others, executioners lived out their days as curiosities, relics of a harsher past. Their children married freely, their names lost the old taint, and their dynasties dissolved into ordinary society. But the memory of their role endures in history books, in folklore, and in the quiet recognition that justice has always been entwined with those willing to carry out its harshest demands. So when we look back at the medieval executioner, what do we see? A pariah, marked by shame. A professional, skilled in his craft. A servant of justice, or a symbol of cruelty. In truth, we see all of these. His legacy is not simple, for it carries the contradictions of a society that both despised and needed him, rejected and relied upon him. And perhaps the final reflection is this: the executioner forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that justice has always required hands to enforce it. Law is written in words, but in the medieval world, it was made real by the swing of an axe or the tightening of a rope. The executioner was not merely a figure of fear, he was the embodiment of justice made visible, the final link in the chain of authority. And so we end with one last question: when history remembers those who wielded the sword of justice, should it remember them with condemnation, with sympathy, or with a recognition of the burden they bore?